Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Monte Maritz. I'm a partner associate at Wight. I'm joined by my fellow associate Lucy Jacobs and our marketing executive Zoe Newman on this webinar and this afternoon to discuss financial planning with integrated business planning, creating a single process for your business. Before we get started, to introduce ourselves a little bit further, it does feel a bit strange talking about a financial planning process or a business planning process in these uncertain times, and especially given all of the events surrounding the COVID-19 outbreak in all the different areas where we all work. So from our side, we just wanted to start by saying that we recognize that a lot of what we are facing with today is not just about business challenges, about personal challenges, and our thoughts go out to everybody who is affected by this in some way or another, in how they and impacted by this. We recognize that these are challenging times, and obviously, as much as we will cover a future planning process today, we'll also touch on themes specifically related to these challenges as we go through the webinar. So just to introduce myself, I'm an associate with Wight. I have worked with many businesses over a number of years now to help them understand integrated business planning and turn that into a process that runs their business. Integrated business planning has become quite pervasive, and many of the best companies in the world now use it to formally align their total business. And as a finance person, I'm especially excited when I see finance teams come on board and start recognizing that this is a better way to produce their financial plans and to add value to their roles. So happy to be here, and I'm happy to also be joined by my colleague Lucy Jacobs.
Hello there, everybody. My name's Lucy Jacobs. I have a background in finance, also in supply chain and business transformation. So this topic is really deeply personal and very passionate for me in terms of how do we really integrate our financial planning and our business leadership and decision-making processes. It touches, in particular from a finance background, the way in which we do our daily work and the value that we can derive from that. So I'm really pleased to be talking to you about this today. Thanks, Monty.
Thanks, Lucy. And just maybe for those who are not fully familiar with Wight, maybe just a bit of an introduction to our business. We've been thought leadership for about 50 years now this year in terms of helping businesses understand how to best plan and integrate their processes. What started in the early days as materials planning has evolved into sales and operations planning and has evolved into integrated business planning. But we're proud of our thought leadership, and we recognize as we sit here today that these processes have served the past, but as the world changes and as the future becomes more and more uncertain, we also need to be looking forward. And this webinar today is also part of our ongoing series on the future of IBP and how do we see this process evolving more and more as a total business process that's not only disciplined, but responsive and able to set your business up for success within the rapidly changing environment that we see, not only when we are faced with the uncertain events like we are at the moment, but also with consumers who change their minds quicker, with channels that are always changing, and with new entrants and new products that are continually hitting our markets. So as an organization, we are continuously reflecting on this, and we share this knowledge because we firmly believe and have always believed at Wight that knowledge is the key to success, that businesses who perform better than other businesses do that because they invest in knowledge partnerships and bring that knowledge sustainably into their own teams, which is and this mission to not only own but share our knowledge has been part of our DNA for the last 50 years, and hopefully today we can share some of that knowledge with you as well. Just to go through the agenda for the day, what we want to cover for today is I just want to talk a little bit quickly in the beginning about integrated business planning, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is in the context of integrated business planning and the process that we see evolve currently and continually evolving to run the business. We want to just touch on budgeting and traditional forecasting, because what we find in so many organizations is that these processes are in conflict with the integrated business planning process and often create behaviors and create unintended consequences that makes us unyieldy, but also in potentially disempowers our finance teams to play the real role that they need to play. We want to show you how a relevant rolling forecast can then become the key to unlocking value and be the process that drives not only your business planning, but your financial planning effectively. We want to talk a little about how do we then use that process to manage change. Business planning and business forecasting should not be static. It should be responsive to the changes we see. But how do we do that? How do we bring that into a process? And especially financial processes that are measured for accuracy, measured for reliability, and in many cases measured for stability. What we'll hopefully do then is give you a vision of how finance can become a true business partner, and how by integrating your financial planning process with your IBP process, you're not just unlocking value for the business, but then you're unlocking your finance team to add value in a new and changing world. During the course of the webinar, we're going to have 2 quick polls. There's been some information shared about how to do those polls. You can do that in the app that we are using. We just want to get your views on where you stand today in your business, and we'll introduce those as we go along. And finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll just close up, but we'll also hopefully have some time for some questions. You can enter your questions into the app as well, and we will pick up on any questions that come through. If you do ask a question and we don't get to it, we will get to all the questions either in the session today, but if not, with you directly, or in an email that will follow the webinar to all of the participants. If there was enough questions that warranted an answer that we didn't get to. So please feel free to ask your questions as we go through the process. As I move on then, we are here today because we feel very strongly that IBP is an evolving process. Many of its principles are continuously changing because the world of work is changing and the way we need to plan is changing. And integrated business planning today is becoming more and more relevant for the businesses we work with. And one of the exciting things we've seen as we've worked with many of the more progressive companies is this need from the finance team to not only be part of this journey, but own this process. When integrated business planning started, it was designed to help the organization balance its forward view and close the gap between its ambition and its latest plans. And it was mainly driven by the business planning functions, first supply chain, then demand management. But more and more, the finance teams are beginning to say, but actually this process is ideally suited to continually show the executives where the business is planning to go and how it will end up. And it's important that as this process evolves, it serves that need, that finance is not just in the process, but is fundamentally helping to shape it. And in that, the process creates new roles, it challenges traditional norms, and it continues to evolve as the business decision-making process as a whole. So at the heart of what we're talking about today from a financial planning perspective is this integration with your integrated business planning process. There is lots of literature on the integrated business planning. There's lots of you who are working in businesses that have integrated business planning processes at various levels of maturity. And it's important that we understand that process is a critical enabler, as we will show today, for the successful integration of a rolling financial forecasting planning process. But as you will see from the next slide, it's not just integrated business planning that's evolving, it's also the world around us. We are faced with many challenges today, some of them unexpected. You'll see from the slide that I've gotten there that COVID-19, which we are all dealing with right now, is one of these black swan events that we feel and see hit our businesses. But it's not the only one. There are many other examples of things that are changing faster than we anticipated and could impact our businesses going forward. And it's important that we are ready for that, not just in terms of the way we run our business, but in the way we plan our business. And traditional planning methods that require businesses to have a static forward view without change will become more and more updated as the speed of work is changing. Secondly, it's important that we see that technology is changing the world. We know as finance executives that many of the traditional finance functions are being challenged by technology, and that this technology is changing the way we work. I read an article recently where they said that 95% of the backward-focused finance activities in businesses will be replaced by AI in 5 or 10 or 15 years. As a finance person, that makes me nervous, but it also makes me excited because it means that we are going to be forced to replace the way we work with a different focus. And at the same time, there is more and more pressure from the business on finance to come to the table and help with decision making. All over the world, executives are struggling with the speed of change, and they want the clever people, their experts, often in the finance departments, to be at the table helping to shape the future of their businesses. So it's important that as we design the future of IBP and as we design the future of rolling financial planning, we also emancipate our finance teams to be able to fulfill a more value-adding role. I'm going to hand over to Lucy to talk a little bit about that in terms of how we are doing it today traditionally, but also how that can change into a rolling forecast.
Thanks very much, Monty. So initially I wanted to reflect on what really is wrong with the budgeting systems that a lot of us have got in place. And as we were thinking about that, we were thinking about the amount of time that is invested in creating an annual budget and the amount of time that is created in then reinventing that annual budget. I remember being in finance and perhaps spending 3 or 4 months of extortionate long-hour days to get to a number that was precisely right but is out of date within a month's time. And in particular, when we see big events like the COVID-19, things get very inaccurate very quickly. But even within the businesses that I worked in, within 3 months or 6 months, they were largely beyond relevant. But they don't just take a lot of time as we're investing in creating it to the nth level of detail. We then use it as a management tool. So we're referring back to it over and over and over to manage to it. And it becomes a blame game, which can then disempower people from really coming together and bringing the best minds together to solving, well, what are the new problems that are on the plate? Because really, we're assigning blame to each other about why one point in time data didn't come true. But we kind of, because we've invested so much time into creating the budget, we get over invested in it. And we can take that inaccuracy as being a personal slight as to why things have gone wrong. And then we need to sort of keep on energizing it with the reforecasting. So what we thought would be helpful for us in terms of thinking how we can support businesses going through so much change at the moment was to ask you through a poll to reflect on how is this in your business at the moment. So one option is an unrealistic budget. I'm not sure how many people this will resonate with, but the budget that comes down from on high with this is your target and this is going to be what you have for next year. Make it work, make it happen. Got an enormous bias to it, but even from day one, we know that this isn't going to happen. A standalone detailed plan, perhaps where finance are operating in a vacuum, maybe reporting through a different line, a different corporate centre, but it's got little relevance to what the sales and marketing are working on or operational improvement initiatives, but an enormous document. So this is another failure mode that we see. Also, a static target, that we've got a one-time, pretty well understood document but it's got a limited scope for change or post-publication review. That one point in time was pretty good snapshot of where we thought we would be next year, but out of date pretty quickly. In terms of an integrated process, this is really where we start to see the business joining together and getting a holistic view of where we see the business going in the future. So realistic assumptions are based on what do we think is going to happen in the market, and that's agreed across finance, across operations, sales and marketing, or engineering, all the different areas, so that we can understand what it's founded on and we can review any changes as it happens. And finally, AOP as a non-event. By this, we mean that we are replanning our business on a monthly cycle, taking into account what changes are happening in the environment externally and internally to us. We're constantly realigning on what do those external changes mean to our business, and therefore flicking the switch to turn that into a new plan is as efficient, or if not more efficient, than a forecast that we would compare to the plan. So if you could just poll to see how is the AOP or budgeting process in your business? We'll just give you a moment to have a think about that. I think it's sometimes difficult to select one, to be honest. I'm not sure. Can we see the votes coming in yet, Zoe? Oh, yeah, super. So the largest one is as a static target, and I think that that's a pretty good, fair reflection on the businesses that we've see and we support. That finance as a function is often one of the best educated and the best and hardest working, to be fair, functions within an organisation. But the rules and parameters that they work within are quite confined. So a static target where they're pulling good information towards them, but it's losing its value fairly quickly. Unrealistic plans, I think that can often be driven by bias and people not really being wanting to hear the truth as we know it, that we've not got an environment where we're able to share. A standalone plan in a vacuum, again, we see that fairly often. But it's really good to see that we're starting to see some companies moving towards a more fully integrated process. And we've even got some folks who have got an AOP as a non-event, which is really, really good to see. Have you got any thoughts on that, Monte?
I think it's interesting, Lucy. I think the poll tells us a lot of what we see in industry, which is that the challenge with the traditional unrealistic budget is clear, but we're struggling to move away from financial planning as an event. That we want to stand still, we want to get as much information as possible, want to create a plan that at a point in time adds real value, and then we want to move forward and do other things. And I think that's why today's message is so exciting, because what we want to be doing is want to be saying, how do we convert this event into something that's continually updated as we get changes from the outside world, and how do we capacitate for that? In other words, it's not going to happen by accident. We know how much effort goes into the budget process or the AOP process, but how do we make sure that our process is aligned so that we deliver that? So I think this is very reflective, not just of what we see, but of the ambition we have, which is to get everybody into that bottom line.
Yeah. Super. I think it feeds well into the next slides, doesn't it, in terms of how do we move towards more of an integrated financial planning process with IBP? Because moving down each row is going to add benefit to the business. So if I can just describe what does it feel like when you're in a integrated financial planning process with IBP up and running and running well? The organisation is really coming together around clear understanding of who's making what decisions and where, and who's accountable for what sets of data. It typically has got a horizon going out over at least 24 months. Now, in today's environment, where we've got such rapidly changing environment, it's easy for us to let go of those cadences and those planning processes, because it feels like the work isn't driving any value. It's not going to get us anything for the here and now. But the difficulty is, if we don't focus on how are we going to come out of it, it's going to give us as much of a surprise as how much we've gone into it, and to the extent in which we've seen volumes either increase or decrease due to COVID-19, depending on what industry we're in. But aligning ourselves around common sets of assumptions, so that we don't have, for example, sales and marketing trying to discount product while operations are seeing increased costs, or closing factories, or things that are out of sync. Using the planning process to really bring together what are the decisions that we're making and what impact does that have on our product portfolio planning, which would be what new products are we introducing or retiring in our organisation. Our demand plan, what's the volume that we're going to sell, at what price and what margin do we anticipate making? our supply plan, what's the cost of what we're doing, and getting this really at the right level of detail, we need to have roughly right. One of the poll topics that we touched on was bias coming down through the plan, and sometimes that's through a kind of inbuilt optimism or pessimism of people's individual attitudes, and sometimes that can be a bigger cultural feeling where leaders won't hear the truth. So for our financial plans and our business plans, our operational plans to really hold value, we've got to be open and transparent to enable people to speak their truth and be able to put forward the truth as they know it. Now, the sort of assumptions at the moment that we might be thinking about would be, well, how long do we think that this change is going to be upon us? How deep do we expect it to be? Do we think that this is going to have a long-term impact on people channel switching, or on a new way of living almost, as people are doing perhaps less travel and we see changes in the environment? Is this going to have a longer-term impact on our market? Now, how do we really practically hold together these different strains of plans within one cohesive network through integrated business planning is high on a lot of people's agenda. And my recommendation there would really be that we keep to our roles and we keep to our reviews almost more sacredly than we would before, because the people who are good at executing the short term, our material planners, our managers, they're the ones who are best to solve the short-term crisis, to be able to understand which suppliers have got capacity, or where are we able to get short-term warehousing, and giving them the freedom and flexibility within your existing execution processes should give the people who are thinking about the long term still the time to think about the long term with a bit of additional support. So as we're thinking about integrated business planning, it's not just the longer term, it's also how do we integrate that with the short-term activities. So if we think about, well, how does the overall business planning environment impact and link in with the rolling financial forecasting? And there are a few characteristics here that are particularly precedent. One of them is one set of numbers. We really don't want operations buying into one set of volumes, sales and marketing focusing on different products, a misalignment in leadership direction. Now, in a situation like we're in at the moment, it's easy for people to have very different views of what they think is likely to happen and likely to be the outcome. There are some points in history that may be of interest and reference, perhaps what was the impact after 9/11 or SARS, or the recession in 2008. Even those aren't really applicable. But what I would say is, whatever your assumption, this is a rolling, continuous re-optimization. Once a month, we get a chance to redo it. It's got to be roughly right, and certainly never going to be precisely correct. So don't even go for precisely wrong. We will continuously re-optimize, but aligning the business around one set of financial numbers that's driven from one lot of business plans from the standard feeder processes really gives us a chance for re-optimization. Now, this takes a lot of work, and Monte at the beginning really was talking to the role of finance is going to change in the future. A lot of the historic budgeting and reporting that has taken up a lot of finance time will be replaced with AI. But really, if you think through the role of preparing these scenarios, these options, these choices, what's the cost benefit, return on investment, we need the skills of people to be able to facilitate this. The process won't spit it out in itself. You need people bringing leaders together, challenging them, coming up with tools and systems and processes and action plans that drive these financial plans to life. And often it's the financial folks who've got the fantastic skills to be able to deliver that. Now, Monte is going to talk a little bit more about how we manage the change in this dynamic environment.
So I think, yeah, thanks, Lucy. Thanks for that. And I think it's important to understand that when we move from a traditional way of planning to a rolling financial forecasting, sometimes I get this look from scared finance guys, and they're looking at me and they're going, that means we're moving the budgeting process from an annual process to a monthly process. And I think it's not quite there. It's yes, it is moving from a static planning process to a dynamic planning process, but it's also recognizing that we're moving from a collecting process where we collect as much information as possible and put it together to a responsive process where we're only really focusing on, has there been a change? A mature integrated business planning process will have a good foundation and a good foundational plan in it. So we should only really be interested in what has changed. Where have we picked up new information that potentially calls our future plans at risk? And then when we have that new information, what do we need to do to make sure that there's a response? So it's about recognizing the change, reporting it effectively into a process where the management is present, not keeping it in the passages or in small circles, but bringing it visibly into the organization and then responding to it. Now, a big part of that visibility, and I'll touch on that in the next slide as well, is that the visibility needs to be accepted. I work with some organizations where if you come to the business with a new view or a new opinion that's potentially more negative than what we had before, and there's almost sort of an inherent resistance to the message. And I think that's important, is that showing change does not mean accepting change. Showing change means that we are preparing to respond to it and make it, and with a decision or a project. Obviously, the other big thing for us is this concept of a range of outcomes. I often joke when I work with finance teams, and I say when we were taught in finance how to work, we were taught that if the balance sheet doesn't balance, then we don't get it right. And that's almost instilled in us this thing that there can only be one answer. But in a rolling financial forecasting world, we're working with a range of outcomes. We're looking at the upside and the downside, the potential variability of what we need to do. And it's almost not just about being ready for a range of outcomes, but being prepared for variability, knowing that over the course of a number of months or a period, there could be a range that concludes at the result where we want, but maybe not in month or in the month. It takes time for the peaks and valleys to balance out as the market responds to the forces that's there. And therefore, it's important that we not only articulate the changes clearly, but the upsides and the downsides. And although we like to use the terms opportunity and vulnerability, for those who've worked with us before knows an opportunity is something that we are expecting that we've got visibility of that could be an upside, but it's not formally in our plans. We're not quite ready for it yet. A vulnerability is something that's in our plan, but it's a risk. But the principle here is this range of outcomes, is to say, well, we have a collective range of outcomes that we could target, and that we need to resource for all of them. It's not about picking the right one. It's about being ready for all of the ranges and being responsive to the full ranges that comes towards the reality of today. The other important point I just want to make before I move on is the fact that a lot of us are caught up in the short term. We need to deliver the month. We need to deliver the quarter. And often that consumes us. We want to know, are we going to hit the numbers? Are we going to get there? And it's important that we also start recognizing that in the short term, there is always variability. There's always going to be upsides and downsides. And sometimes the value comes from casting our eyes over the parapet and saying, actually, if I look at this 3, 4, 5, 6 months into the future, the variability plays itself out, and the stability of my business model, the stability of my base assumptions will create the future that I want and the result that I want. That it's not just about stretching for every line, every day, every week. But I mean, that takes some change, but that also takes some comfort that the plans are reliable. So if we go to the next slide, what we want to make sure is that as we look at our ambition versus our reality, that we are talking about a reliable view. Finance teams and finance planning is often the CEO's last resort to get the right number, because they are not comfortable with the reliability of the underlying plans that come from the business. And for us to be able to manage rolling financial forecasting, we have to make sure that what we see is reliable, but also informed. And when I talk about informed, I mean that many of the businesses we work with, we create forward plans that are based on hope or dreams or speculation or things that we still plan to do, but we don't know what it is. it's important that if we do make forward plans, that we understand, if we have an ambition, a top-down, what would we like to do, that we understand what are the levers that we're expecting to deliver those plans so that we can measure against those levers. And secondly, when we bring a different view from the process, we need to be comfortable as a leadership that that view is the correct view, that that latest view is what we believe will really happen, so that if we're then investing in a response, we're investing in the right response. Now, the assumptions that drive that and the process that drives it gets credibility from involvement. And I often say when I speak to teams about financial planning is that you'll only get the credibility in the process if you are in the process. If you're expecting to process to deliver in its own right, when you're so critical to its success in terms of understanding what's required, then you're just setting yourself up for failure. So one of the big messages we have for finance leaders is that they need to find the time and the focus to be inside of this rolling business planning process and add value there, and not wait for it to produce the result that they want before they engage with it in a meaningful way. That means that if we, and if I just touch on the next slide, it means that our roles will change. If we are thinking about a rolling financial forecasting process, we're not just creating a rolling forward planning process because we want a better number. We're creating a rolling forward planning process because we want to drive decisions, we want to drive action, we want to drive change. And that means that our roles will change. We will go from a position where we are looking at assembling informations, assembling forecasts, to insight, to influence, and ultimately to drive impact in the business. Because what we're doing is we're saying, in understanding the future, the response is the most important part. And we are part of that response. Our knowledge, our capability, our insight into the change is part of that response. And we can only deliver that response if we're invested in the process that delivers that. Lucy, I'm sure you want to just talk about some of the principles to support that.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So I mentioned earlier that it really is aligning what are our financial processes with our practical business management processes. One set of numbers isn't about one definitive perfect number. It's about everyone aligned to production values, volumes that support sales, that support our latest financial projections. Now, in a really emotional time that we're all in, it can mean that people stop communicating. They get paralyzed by fear. They go off and react in ways in which are a little bit less predictable than normal. So I would really urge, as often is the logical voice of finance that comes out in an organization, is how do we use our existing processes to bring people together around one set of reviews? One calendar is actually something that even in standard business operating environment really helps bringing people together. If the operational decision-making calendar has got the same cadence as the finance calendar, then usually they sit and align together really well. But what I mean about how do we respond rather than react, how do we use our processes rather than our emotions to drive decision-making at the moment? Well, how do we run scenarios using sandpits or sort of playpens or whatever your systems are, to look at what are those one set of numbers that would give that range that Monte talked about earlier with the vulnerabilities and opportunities, so that as a business you can understand what's likely to be in the short, medium and long term and pull that together through your set of reviews. So through doing that, to go full circle round to where we started about the annual budgeting process, it really looks like we're coming to, through industry, towards the end of the annual budgeting process. It's going to be more of an iterative situation where we've got trusted plans that are supported by business-wide assumptions, not your kind of once a year flash that comes out from corporate with this is what our exchange rate is going to be for next year. More deeper understanding of what do we think is going to happen within our market dynamics or disruptors or supply costs that really give us our changing environment month on month. that's unbiased, as in wherever we go, we believe it. Monte mentioned a bit about the gap. Having a stretch isn't a bad thing, but it's not in our plan. We need it visible so we can understand what our actions are going to be to close the gap. And it's aligned to strategy because we're all around, all based around the same plans. So thank you very much for that. I think, Monty, we're going to go into...
Lucy, if I could just add something on this slide. I think what's important is that when we look at the annual budgeting process and the process that will replace it, we've got to recognize that the value sits in a common reliability of the view. When we trust the plan that we have, that's a rolling 24-month plan in our business, when we've added value to it, when we believe that it is the most realistic view of the future at any given point in time, then budgeting really, or annual planning really, becomes a formal acceptance of the view we have.
Yeah.
And that means that we've invested our effort into the process that delivers that view, as opposed to a process that's separate, that contains a whole lot of alternative processes to create a view and to create an outcome. We've taken the trap of unreliability that we have in existing processes that we often fall into when we publish a very complex process to deliver an annual plan, even though we get it right as per the poll earlier, and accept that the information that's coming up from the business is reliable. But to Lucy's point on earlier as well, it's important that comes out of a common process in the business. One calendar, one set of reviews, one set of numbers, and that we recognize that for us as finance leaders, that's often a behavior change that we've got to do. It's not just about pitching up and pitching in. It's just about accepting that that's a new role for us. Now, I'm not saying that's true for everybody, but certainly a lot of the finance executives I work with, there is a little bit of that change management that's required, that step out and step back in from one process into the next. And but as I can assure you, it's a very exciting change and often a very empowering change. If I can go to if we then can go to the next poll, we just want to understand a little bit of, we understood a little bit about your budgeting process. Now, maybe just for those of you who are involved in finance or work with your finance teams, just a little bit of understanding where we are with that role in terms of where we are in the business. If you look at those teams, are they not really involved in any way? They are reporters and they create the budget, but after that they step away from the business. Or do they have forecasting and planning processes, but it's independent, it's their own processes, they create their own information, their own databases, often their own spreadsheets that are meant to help the business understand the future. I see a lot of finance people enjoy IBP not for the long-term benefit, but because they think that they can get confirmation of the short-term forecast. They're still trapped in the world where they want to continually validate the short-term performance, and they come to the IBP meetings to check up on the rest of the business to make sure that they are still delivering the plan that everybody agreed. Maybe that's how you see your finance team. I see finance teams fully engaged in an IBP cycle. They're in the meetings, they're helping to financialize the plans, they're supporting the principle of one set of numbers, they're excited by it. And then finally, I suppose the end result is a finance team that's not just engaged, but is transitioned from their role as financializers of the plan to co-conspirators when it comes to the response and helping actually build the plans and the scenarios, because they don't have to spend so much time building up the plan. They have time to then influence the outcomes of the changes that's required. Maybe just give us a view of where you think you are or your teams are in your business, and then we can maybe spend a few minutes talking about that. So just looking at the results, interesting, but I suppose not surprising. It's certainly what we see in most of the businesses that we encounter, especially in the early maturity. I mean, when we start the change management journey with businesses on integrated business planning and rolling financial forecasting, often the biggest change we have to that we have to address is this: we prefer to do our own process because we trust it more, it's more reliable, it's better, it creates more reliable results. I get asked by the leadership team to do it. There's a whole infrastructure that supports this process. And because often it is actually not bad, it's a big change management to then get that team to move that back into the business. So looking at the rest, there's a good balance of outcomes, some not formally involved, some focused on the process and engaged. But I think the key for me here is that if the majority of our businesses is in the green space, and if we go back to where we started, which we said the majority of our businesses play a role in creating a static forward view, then these two things almost go hand in hand. That it is in our investment in creating static views that we create our own process. It's in our distrust often with the information that we gather from the business that we then end up with these independent processes. And I can assure you, if you're outside of finance, then you're often frustrated by them, because you wonder sometimes, after going to all of the effort of running an IBP process, why then finance has to spend the time creating their own set of numbers. So all of this talks to the theme of today, which is that we want an aligned process, a common process. And I think also this picks up on a final point from my side on this, which is that's why what we are seeing from an Oliver Wight perspective is that integrated business planning is not just going to finance. More and more finance people are actually coming to us and saying, we need something different. We want to be more aligned to the business. And this process looks like something that can help us align. But then obviously we need to come on board with the rolling financial process that goes hand in hand with this. We've got to take our, and I apologize, this might sound a bit harsh, but our ivory tower expertise and push it into the process that we need. Obviously, what that means for us is, as integrated finance leaders of the future, is that we need to be coming into the process a lot more. I like to talk about the integrated finance leader of the future because, as you know, we are advocates of the process, and we strongly believe in its ability to deliver a result. But it also implies that we have to move into the business. And the rolling financial forecast, the theme of the topic today, is about showing that it's that transition from I need the right number and I need it delivered in a reliable way to I need a process that continuously evolves as I get new information that supports my own objectives but also releases me to add value, is the key to this. It's the, you know, for those who've worked with us, we know we often say behavior before process before tools. And just like anywhere else, from an Oliver Wight perspective, when it comes to rolling financial forecasting, we have to change the behavior that then drives the focus on the process and the tools. We can't just put a process in place that delivers rolling financial forecasting if we haven't changed the fundamental behavior that supports the traditional ways of working. Obviously, the success at the end of this is finance leaders that are forward thinking. We're moving away from this continuous review of what happened last month, what's happening this month, and start to think about what is going to change in the future that we need to address. We talk about relevance versus accuracy. There is the future. You're never going to be right about the future. I often joke and I say people who can predict the future with accuracy are not going to be in business or corporate roles. And that's the truth. We are working with an uncertain future. We're working with an uncertain future today, given where we are with this epidemic and of the influences of it. But tomorrow there'll be something else, and the next day there'll be something different. What we need to be looking for is the relevant information that we need to respond to. Where do we pick up new knowledge that requires a response, as opposed to being obsessed with getting it right all the time? New knowledge drives new decisions. So if we then go and we say, well, actually what we want to do is we want to move away from just reporting the issue to helping the business make the right decisions, then it also changes the kind of information that we need from our rolling forecast. Less about the data, less about the detail, and more about the things that we've picked up that could impact our future so that we can influence them. From that, we'll become the business partner. We'll start managing change, and not chance, but change, I apologize, and not protecting the status quo, not having this, why did you not hit the plan? Why are you not delivering what we agreed? But actually talking about the changes that we need to manage. And obviously what we're seeing more and more is that finance are not just becoming IBP or integrated business planning participants, they're becoming integrated business planning champions. They are actually the people that's asking for the process, that's driving the process, and that's helping us ensure its success, which is very important in delivering this. That's my view. I feel very passionate about this process. I think integrated business planning is the integrated business planning process of the future, is the key that unlocks the real value of our finance teams once they come in on board with their processes as well. And Lucy, I'm sure you've seen something similar in your experience as well.
Yeah, I completely agree, Monty. I think for me, finance really embedding into the integrated business planning process is what makes it come alive and makes it sing. I think when you get a fantastic finance person who can picture what's on the mind of the CEO and how to orchestrate what are those scenarios and possibilities, so that the information that their finance teams are really helping to drive decision making and business solutions, it's just brilliant. It's a really feel-good thing for the finance team and for the business overall. Having worked in business environments where the same monthly accounting spreadsheets are sent out time after time, but not really addressing, well, what's the decision making, what's the issue we're trying to get to, how are we trying to drive improvement in the organisation, it's night and day different and so much more satisfying. So yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. That's sort of the end of our formal slides, but I'm going to get into the questions now. I have a question here, which is quite a lot of quite a lot of the key themes, but I think is important just to pick on. I'll read it to you and then I'll answer it, and then how can the traditional budgeting be replaced with rolling plans and practice? Obviously, you need to give up quite a bit of detail. How do you define the right level of detail needed? What IT tools are other companies using to run this? So maybe there's sort of three questions in one, and I'll touch on all three very quickly. The challenge with replacing the traditional budgeting with the rolling plan and practice is there's two sides to it. There's obviously the reliability of the rolling plan. So remember Lucy spoke about a 24-month rolling plan. So if we take the horizon of the rolling plan out far enough, then there's the next budget period is always in the plan. So when we then get to budget times, instead of going and saying we need a whole separate process for budgeting, if there's a request for a budget or an annual plan, what we do is we say to the business, over the next cycle, we are going to lock in the forward view for investment purposes, reporting purposes, whatever the statutory purpose is. Could we please put some rigor into the process and ensure that all of the assumptions are clear? We might introduce a few extra activities in that cycle just to make sure that it's aligned. But we are doing that within our cycle. We're not creating a separate process. So that what we can do then is we can lift the budget period out of our trusted 24-month rolling process and take it forward. In terms of level of detail, I think it's a very important point. This and one I feel quite strongly about is that I think sometimes we confuse level of detail with accuracy, and that the more detail we have, the more accurate it might be. But actually, if we think about it, the level of detail should ideally sit where the business's real change drivers sit. And if we are going to have market changes or cost changes that influence us in a way that it's fundamentally changing our business model, I'm not talking about the price increase here or the competitor A versus competitor B in market there. I'm talking about the fundamental changes that will get our shareholders and our leadership excited. Then often that sets a higher level of detail. And I think sometimes we need to say to ourselves, let's start at the level of detail that's relevant for the leadership and get that right within an order of change that we are comfortable with, and then work that down from a confirmation perspective, as opposed to saying that if we add up every single level of detail and we bring it up, then we'll get accuracy. And just from a practical perspective, we see that so often, because often in businesses we spend 3 months building up a very detailed plan, take that to the leader, and the leader will say, well, I think your total revenue number is off by 5%. I think you can change that. And suddenly what we managed at a very low level of detail has been changed at a very high level of detail. And we're almost now need to cascade that change down. But a big part of your process design, I won't shy away from it, is about understanding where this relevant level of detail sits in your business. Just a quick note about tools. I think there's lots of tools that can do it. We've seen most of the software vendors these days bring out tools. The critical thing to this, of course, is to be able to manage the instances. So be able to say, I can store my plan as it was 3 months ago, and I can store my plan as it is this month, and I can compare these instances. What I see, certainly in many of the businesses I work with, is that there is a locked-in budget, and then there is no way. We lock it into our ERP, we lock it into our system, and we don't have the ability to then report an alternative view or an alternative plan against that. So from a design perspective, I would just make sure that your tool sets are able to store different versions of your plan. And then secondly, what's important is that your tool set can manage assumptions, so that you can forecast in your tools using drivers or assumptions to say, well, I'm expecting this cost driver to change by 10%, and then be able to cascade that down or up, so that you can use aggregation or disaggregation to manage the detail, as opposed to having to go down to the lowest level of detail on every item and do that. Just I know I'm giving quite a long answer, but just to bring that into a more practical perspective, for example, if you decide that you want to forecast a 5% change in your revenue number because of market conditions, not being able to go down to every SKU in every region and have to change it there, but to change it at a higher aggregate level and to cascade that down, adds a lot of value to the rolling financial process, but also makes it a lot more responsive. Lucy, I think if you don't mind taking one of the next questions, I see we've got quite a few, as I mentioned before. We'll not get to everyone now, but whatever we don't get to, we'll pop an email out to everybody just on our answer to that.
Yeah, sure. And from a summary perspective, I'm sure I'll be able to pick up a couple. We've had a question from Louis about how do you change a business culture that are continually pushing unrealistic plans and bias? And oh my goodness, I feel your pain. I think that most of us have been in that situation before. For me, there's two ways of doing it. One is a conversation with the leadership team of, do you understand the consequences that you're driving? People can't meet the plans, therefore we're wasting our energy in misalignment of understanding of the strategy and the plans. Here's an estimate of the waste in which it's generating in the organisation, the frustration, the lack of credibility. So what's the impact? The other way is to look at it really clearly as a gap. So what is our bottom-up plan coming from our IBP process? Where does that get us? And how does that compare to where you want us to be? And try and help engage the leadership who are pushing the target to have that as their target rather than overwriting the bottom-up plans. If you can then see what's the gap, then you can try and get the creative brains in the business focused around what are the different options we've got to solve that gap, rather than it being a, this is my truth, let me overwrite yours, there's only one way, dictatorial response. Although they're practical things that you can do, it really doesn't come easy. And from my perspective, I needed to get in some help for people to have conversations with the leaders, because it doesn't always sit well when it's you telling your boss that's you know, that they're not in a realistic place with their business plans or aspirations. So that was one question that we had. Another one comes in from Greg, which is really talking about the impact of burn rate on cash. Most companies don't really focus on cash flow and burn rate in their standard day-to-day processes. We might see working capital coming through in terms of inventory, AR and AP, but the burn rate of cash, Greg is mentioning with the COVID crisis, is becoming more and more critical to business management. And we know if we're not solving business management issues through the IBP process, then there will become another decision-making forum. So you're quite right, Greg, to bring it up. It needs to adapt into the forum. KPIs would be the way to go, and it's understanding what are the operational levers that are going to drive that. Then how do we link in whether what cash management activities that we've got as an organisation, and how that's going to fund investment into, even it can get as tactical as new purchase orders from our suppliers. So I would map out what are your levers, and make sure that you're including it in your headlines for your leadership team in the IBP process. Monte, back to you. I don't know how many more. We might be able to get one more in.
There's a few questions that's asking the same thing, and I think it would be a very good point, a very good place to end. As I said, the question basically, how do I get my finance team to buy into integrated business planning and rolling financial forecasting as the better way to plan and to come on board? And I think for me, that's become more and more of a relevant question, because as I said to you earlier in the webinar, we just see more and more businesses and finance teams frustrated with the status quo, but also caught up in it. And I suppose for me, the biggest and easiest answer is they have to believe that this process is better than what they are doing now. And they have to understand how this process will deliver a better result for them. I've seen businesses fail at this when they're trying to get finance to conform. You need to come on board because we are running IBP now. That doesn't work. But I firmly believe that there is a real, clear, value-adding argument for finance teams that if we articulate it in the right way, that they will not only buy into IBP, but they will support it because they'll see the selfish benefits for them in terms of not only the reliability of the numbers, but in terms of their own expanded role as influencers in the business. So I suppose the answer for me is they have to go through a knowledge-driven change management journey in their own right, and they have to see the value of this process for themselves as opposed to what they're doing now. But I've also found that when we've taken teams through that journey, they are consistently supportive, and as I said, even taking ownership of IBP in the business because of the value it gives them. So I think, let's frame it. For me, it's about framing IBP as a financial planning process that adds real value for the business and making sure that message is clearly articulated in your implementation and into your change management journeys. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the webinar, and that brings us to the end of the hour. Thank you for your time. Thank you for dialing in. Obviously, a lot of things going on, a lot of people working from home, a lot of people trying to coordinate this new way of working, but we appreciate your time listening to us. The recording will be available, and if you need any further information, please contact myself or Lucy or the Oliver Wight office, and we'll be happy to support you with what you need. Thank you very much. Lucy?
Yep, thank you very much indeed. Have a good day.